Welcome to Prose and Cons, a podcast by writers for writers, brought to you by Precipice Fiction. Precipice Fiction would like to acknowledge the people of the Eora and Durag nations as the original custodians and storytellers of the land this podcast was created on.
Welcome to Pros and Cons, the Precipice Fiction podcast by emerging writers for emerging writers, because sometimes we feel like pros and sometimes we feel like cons. I'm Paddy Boylan, hosting for today, and joining me are my friends and colleagues Matan Elul.
Hi, my name is Matan. I'm a high school teacher who tries to instill the beauty of grammar in teenagers and also writes the rest of the time, mostly horror and fantasy.
What a nice way to put it. Instill the beauty of grammar.
Failing to instill.
I'm sure you're doing great. Alex Eldridge.
Hi, yes, my name is Alex Eldridge. I am a writer. I've predominantly written sci-fi and fantasy. I've got two sort of draft novels that I've sort of completed, and lots of short stories, one of which was in the Big Issues Fiction edition last year. I actually just saw that's coming up again, so I might submit something else for that. But yeah, that's more or less what I do.
And James Healy.
Hello, I'm James Healy. I'm a writer of science fiction and horror. I do a little bit of freelance editing on the side as well. Yeah, that's me.
And I'm Paddy Boylan. I am a technical writer, creative writing teacher, creative writer, and editor. And like, I think most of us, I wear many different hats, which I'm starting to, after talking to more people in the broader writing community, there seems to be a common thing with writers. We all have like a lot of different gigs we're juggling, a lot of different things going on. Today, ladies and gents, we're going to talk about something that I've wanted to talk about for a while. I'm really looking forward to what you guys have on this. Every so often, we come across a book that, for whatever reason, really makes an impression on us. The sort of thing that periodically, as you're reading it, you just need to put down, stare off into space and say, my God, that's good. These are the sorts of works that stay with us for long after you've read them, right? The sorts of things that consciously or unconsciously, in big ways or small, will influence your writing from that point on. Now, that's not to say that based on that wonderful book, you'll necessarily adapt your style in the very next thing you write. It might just be that from that point on, you're made aware of what can be done with prose, structure, character, or theme, and they stay in your writerly toolbox forever. Your writerly toolbox is forever after expanded. Today, we're talking about books that blew our minds. Books that, for whatever reason, personally had a big impact on us that really made us go like, wow, that's a book. Before we get into it, though, let's go around and see what everyone has been reading, writing, watching, playing. Matan, what have you been up to?
So, as I mentioned in the last few episodes, I've been reading Dracula recently, and I think Alex had a similar impression of it. Alex, correct me if I'm wrong, that it's a little uneven, where some parts are really good, really engaging, and other parts feel like maybe this epistolary thing doesn't really work out for a full-length novel. I really like the sections that are the journals of Jonathan. I'm gonna butcher
Harker,
the name.
yeah.
Is it Harkin?
Harker.
Yeah, I love that part. I love the Mina journals. But at some point, I feel like at some point I would just love it if it wasn't only an epistolary novel. I would love some classic dialogue, and that's something that format really suffers from, is that people don't really get to talk as much, someone having to tell you what someone said to them. Sometimes there would be like direct reported speech, but not much, and it kind of makes the pace a bit weird, especially for readers who are used to today's dialogue heavy books. Still enjoying myself. Not exactly a smooth ride.
Yeah, I think you will find there's more dialogue. Are you around midway or before that?
I'm at the point where Lucy's starting to really go sideways.
Okay, I feel like, yeah, once they pass the midpoint, I think there's, like, my memory of it is like there's long stretches of dialogue. I listened to it on the audiobook, and the character who was doing Van Helsing had
I've seen him.
For him. And I remember Van Helsing was like just giving everyone instructions and stuff in these really long segments that were brilliant.
Listen to Precipice Fiction's next pod to see whether Matan has changed his mind.
James, what about yourself? What have you been up to reading, watching, playing wise?
I've been reading Fires on the Plain. which was a Japanese novel that came out around 1956 about a soldier at war. It was written by a lad who had spent time himself in a prisoner of war camp. It was a Japanese prisoner of war. And the book is fictional, but it's about a guy who was essentially discharged from his unit, told to go to the hospital, and if they're not taking people on the hospital, to like just take his own life. And he kind of just wanders through the Burmese jungle in like the last days of the war, like after, probably during the Japan having lost. He's just sort of wandering, and he comes across some Burmese, he comes across some Japanese units the whole time. There's kind of fighting going on in the distance, and he's sort of just wandering and trying to not even necessarily stay alive, just wandering for the sake of wandering. It's a very nihilistic, reflective, introspective kind of book. Paddy, I think you'd probably love it.
Yeah, it sounds like it.
Very good.
You had me at nihilistic.
Yeah. Very, very good. So yeah, I'm reading that at the moment.
Yeah, cool. And what was that called one more time?
The Fires on the Plain. I don't have it handy. I can't tell you who wrote it. The Fires on the Plain, though, it's very good.
I think I've heard of it. I've heard it come up in discussions before.
Yeah, it also was made into a film around the same time, 1950s. Yeah.
Fires on the Plain, one to check out. Alex, what about yourself?
Yeah, what have I been doing? I've been reading Kitchen Confidential by Anthony Bourdain, which is sort of like a biography of famous chef, entrepreneur, writer Anthony Bourdain, just really documenting his life from being a kid and having his first sort of exaltatory experiences of food, right through to being like an absolute piece of work chef, like drug addict, everything just terrible, just a real shitbag. And then sort of his not really coming to Jesus moment, but at least, you know, his kind of getting on the right track thing. It's really, really well written. It's the sort of book that you read it, and while you're reading it, you're completely absorbed, and you'll just go through a chapter like that and be like, oh wow. But then because it's a biography, and it's kind of almost like piecemeal memoirs. Like it's the sort of thing that once you finish a chapter, you're not necessarily super engaged to like come back to it, you know, like you'll forget about it for long stretches of time, but then when you do go back to it, just blaze through it, which is just kind of a quirk of the way it's written specifically. But no, it's very good. I really recommend it.
Okay, you know, I don't think I've ever read a biography before. Not one.
Really?
Yeah, I think so.
I've read heaps of them.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, I don't know why.
Wild.
I just they're good though. I recommend them.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay.
Yeah,
amazing.
or even like, have you read memoirs or anything like that?
I've read Bill Brasson's stuff, which is semi-autobiographical, but it's not exactly a biography. Alex, I might even check out that actually sounds like a really good read.
I'll lend it to you if once I get done.
Do you remember Srinivas from the writers group?
Yeah.
Yes.
Sorry, listeners. Srinivas is a lovely guy from the writers group we used to attend. He wrote like 10, 12 biographies, I believe, all
Cool.
10,000 words or less, which is a great concept. Like, hey, you want to know everything about Marie Curie, but you don't have 25 hours to spare. There's the important bits.
Yeah, let's go.
I think they did pretty well in his native language as well.
Yep.
Yeah, go Srinivas. So I've been watching a TV show. Have you guys heard of a show called The Boys?
Yeah.
Right. Okay, right. Have you guys seen it?
Yeah, I watched two, maybe 3 seasons of it. Yeah.
Okay, I'm late to the party then. Well, it's really memed, and I finally found out where these memes of this like really snarky Captain America superhero cut from.
It is meme to hell.
Love that.
Yeah. No, so for anyone who hasn't seen it, it's kind of like a gritty, realistic take at superheroes, like superheroes in contemporary 21st century America. They have like corporate sponsorship, they have like social media teams, they have like deals with sports drinks and stuff. And not really spoilers, they're really objectively terrible people when you meet them in reality. Like narcissistic, sociopathic, terrible, dysfunctional social lives. It's good. The performances are wonderful. The story is interesting enough to keep me going. One thing that I found is interesting is it uses violence a lot in ways that don't really serve the plot at all. It almost feels like part of their Netflix contract is like, okay, every episode you need at least one scene where someone explodes in a shower of blood, and that's what you got to fulfill. And Like Game of Thrones was violent, but I always felt like it was doing something. It was trying to make us feel something or making some kind of point.
Yeah.
It kind of feels violent for the sake of violent.
I think it is. I think a lot of it was violence for the sake of the gag of violence, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Like the joke of it. I think
think
a
you're
lot
right.
of it is that. But I
Like-
don't know if it how long does that stay funny, I guess.
Yeah.
I look at it like a Tarantino movie.
Yeah.
Like blood doesn't have to come out in a geyser out of his neck for the plot, but that's part of what a Tarantino movie is. Like,
Yeah.
For some reason, I'm more willing to forgive it when it's Tarantino. I don't know. It's not fair. It's double standards, but that's how it be.
No, not if Tarantino's better.
ooh.
I haven't seen it, so I have no dog in this fight. But you know,
No. So The Boys, it's good. It's pretty good. It's watchable. The main character is fabulous and really scary. I'm gonna give it 6.5 out of 10.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's
it's
fun.
great.
It's a fun show.
Okay, gentlemen, books that blew our minds. So these are books that maybe had a massive influence on us as a writer, maybe as a person, something that after reading it, it's the kind of thing that's going to lodge in our brains and stick with us. And I want to see who wants to take the conversation first.
I'm happy to start.
Matan, what do you got?
So I'm just gonna warn you, listeners. Like, for me to go over this book would require a tremendous amount of spoiling. So if you hear the title and you're like, I don't want to be spoiled," you are gonna be spoiled. So think about that before you listen.
We should probably say a blanket, like if we mention one of these books, there's a good chance there's going to be spoilers. So if we mention a book that you don't want spoilers for, maybe just skip forward a minute.
Or 7. If it's in your
7.
shelf, you've been warned. Okay, the book I'm going to talk about is by Kasuo Ishagura, and it's called Never Let Me Go. The reason I chose it, it's not the standard book you'd expect from it, which is not horror per se, it's not fantasy, it's not sci-fi. It's a little bit sci-fi. But the reason that book blew my mind, first of all, a bit of context. When I was 18, my brother bought me 10 books he thought everyone should read. Huckleberry Finn, 100 Years of Solitude, Arabian Nights, some good stuff. One of them was Never Let Me Go. And he told me, Matan, do not Google this book. The less you know, the more you're going to enjoy it. So I didn't. And what that book does is basically it starts as a classic private boarding school in Britain, you know. The hero is a teenage girl, and you think you know where the story is going. She's got that kid that she likes, and her best friend is more attractive than her and a bit more an extrovert, where she's more polite and shy. And you think, okay, it's basically, you know, all right. But something feels off, and you're not sure what it is. And maybe it's because the headmaster seemed to be a bit weird in the way she talks to them, or the fact that this weird woman comes every once in a while to take their paintings, and the woman looks genuinely disgusted by them.
Or would
And
take their paintings like to paint the students.
they paint. No, they do painting, part of art
Okay.
class.
Okay.
And it feels weird. No parents are mentioned. And you have that underlying feeling that something is wrong. And then around page 58, I think, I checked it yesterday, one of the younger teachers just sort of tells them, she hears them talking about what they want to achieve in life. And they say they want to be a movie actress, I want to be a producer, a singer, all that stuff. And the teacher looks genuinely upset about those statements. Spoiler warning. And she tells them, but you guys have been told. You have been told and you still don't get it. That you guys are being raised for your vital organs to be harvested. You're not going to be adults. You're not going to live. And the kids are just like, yeah, okay, well, what do you want? And the story moves forward, and that teacher is never seen again. And I remember putting down the book, and I wasn't even thinking, what the fuck am I reading? I was thinking like, yeah, we would get used to that, wouldn't we?
Yeah.
If that's our life and that's what we know, we would be bummed, but we would keep living our life because that's humanity. Like we do, that's our biggest strength and our biggest weakness. We kind of accept everything that happens to us and we try to keep going. And the way Kasuo Ishiguro, he weaves the plot, eventually the drama of their situation does, it does become the major theme, but all this time, you are also invested in their relationships. It's almost like I was trying to explain to my wife. Imagine that you're reading a love story and everybody's named, but at some point you realize that the two main characters are chicken and they're in a farm. and all the context of what eventually
Mm.
happens to chickens in a farm.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And then they
Yes.
keep talking about the other chicken that they're in love with and how are they going to express their emotions. And you're trying to shout through the pages like, no, get out of the farm.
Right. So the whole thing is contained by this sense of impending doom that I suppose casts a dark light on everything that happens, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that the writing is so good because the fact that they've normalized it is the most horrifying aspect of it.
Yeah.
And that blew
Yeah.
my mind, and that made me think there's so much we can do with writing if we're just kind of brave enough.
Yeah. It sounds kind of Boy in the Strapped Pajamas. Like, I'm not going to spoil that for people because the twist of that book is the thing. But if you know, you know. Like, we get used to the situation in the book, and then there's this amazing Shyamalan twist, and it changes how we viewed everything that came before that point and everything that comes afterward. I love stuff like that.
Yeah, the recontextualization of the entire narrative is that's a big thing. That's like that's the classic twist, the short story twist, but like doing that over the course of a whole novel is very impressive.
Yeah.
It
The
sounds
thing I
almost like to
Yep.
me as well, like the perfect storm of literary fiction and having that like the very detailed, like, hey, this is what's
Yeah.
happening in my tiny life, but with also that like sci-fi freaky deaky element over the top, and having that kind of not drown out all the little details. It sounds like that's what it's doing, which is very cool.
I think what's important, it also happens very early in the book. It's a 300 pager. So it doesn't feel like if anyone watched the movie Remember Me, when you have this romance and then you zoom out and he's standing in one of the Twin Towers and it's 9/11. Like, why did I watch this whole movie just for this guy to be involved in 9/11? It
Wow.
felt
Yeah,
like
right.
more like M. Night Shyamalan when it comes in the end, pulls the rug under your feet, which is also nice sometimes. But here it happens pretty early.
Yeah.
And the fact that life goes on, and sometimes you get this, this friend of mine completed, which is the way they talk about people whose donation has resulted in death.
God.
And
That's so cold.
good stuff.
It sounds like if the reveal came at the end, then it would be a lot of like, okay, but what's happening? Like, why are we getting these details? Why do I care about these characters? And it almost needs to come. I mean, page 58 out of 300 is pretty early. It would need to come early to make everything interesting, like to give the context its weight and its, what's the word, stakes? Speculative fiction or pretty grounded in reality?
Some
Like, it doesn't
people-
sound like this is something that happens, but
It's like a super grounded sci-fi. It's not grounded because what's described is reasonable. It's grounded because you're focusing on the day-to-day application of the sci-fi.
yeah, almost like
if
Handmaid's
the
Tale.
I haven't read that, but
Yes, very much, Paddy. Yeah,
Okay.
it is. Yeah, it just feels like a normal person's story. But then if you were able to zoom out, you'd see that it was a whole thing. But you're so close in on a character, which is great. I think it's a great way to tell a sci-fi story.
Yes,
Great
agreed.
concept.
One of those ideas that makes me wish, like, damn, I wish I'd came up with that. That's so clever.
Yeah, well, you can always, whatever science fiction thing you come up with, you can tell your science fiction story that way if you think it suits. But you can also adapt upon that idea, because I think the book that I've picked was probably very heavily influenced by Never Let Me Go, because I have a very similar starting premise, which is that you're in an isolated school in which the children are kept under quite serious lock and key. The book I'm talking about is The Girl with All the Gifts. The children are kind of kept under lock and key, and the story is told from the perspective of one of the children, one of the teachers, one of the soldiers who works on this base, and one of the scientists who works on this base. And it is revealed during the first act that the world has kind of fallen to a zombie apocalypse, and that there are children that they've found that have the zombie virus but don't exhibit zombie behavior unless they smell people, or unless they smell people. That's what gives it off. So all of the people are wearing stuff to cover their scent. And the reason that it blew me away was more so that it utilizes something called I think I've seen it called different things, but I think you can call it four corner conflicts, which is where you
Okay.
have
Yeah.
characters divided across an axis, where, if I can explain it properly, two of them might always be in agreement, but the rest of them are in disagreement because they're on opposite ends of a point, and it can either be on the opposite ends of a singular point or on a twin point. And I think it works better if it's a twin point, because then it means the conflict is basically like, how does each of the characters interpret the children? And the teacher interprets them as children, and she wants to protect them. So her division is that she sees them as children and she wants to protect them. And because of that, she can be quite a little bit reckless and careless for herself and potentially for others, because she views them as children. She doesn't really view them as being that dangerous. And the opposite from her, you have a soldier who wants to protect people, and he views the children as monsters. They're just a threat. They're dangerous. They need to be treated like zombies, not like people. But his desire is that he wants to protect the people, and both of these characters' positive goal, which is to protect different people, is like really deeply ingrained within those characters. Then you have a scientist, and a scientist wants to protect the children, but wants to protect the children from the perspective of studying them for science. And she performs kind of biopsies and stuff on them. It's really dark. But her attitude is that the children are just behaviors, that it's a virus, that everything that the virus is doing is just adaptive. The reason that the virus behaves like zombies attacking people is to spread the virus, and the reason that the children exhibit childlike behaviors is to like lower the guard of the host species. So she just views them from that perspective. And then you have the main character, who's one of the children, who doesn't really know how to interpret herself as the story goes on. She drifts between, I'm a person, I'm a monster, what am I, kind of. So she's the character who's kind of bouncing in between, but she really wants to protect the teacher. She loves the teacher. So that's kind of the axis the characters are divided on. And as the story develops, it ends up, obviously you can see how that would push all the characters in the conflict as it is, but the plot develops in such a way that this really puts them into like loggerheads with one another. And the reason that the book blew me away is because I absolutely could not put it down, because the characters were constantly, there was always conflict going on at some point, and the conflict was always dependent on the specific issue of like who was going to side with who in each point, depending on who was getting protected and who was being put in danger. But you could probably just tell that story indefinitely, where the characters are continuously in conflict. So obviously the story has a good sense of how long it should be. But as the story goes on, you start to realize that if these characters don't start to resolve this conflict, by the time they get to the end state of what's going on, the decision will be made for them, essentially, and the outcome will be made for them. And obviously, for one character, they get their win state, another character is going to get their like worst case scenario state. So you start to become really invested in how is this going to play out. But each of the characters have really good arguments, really good different reasons for why they want things to play out the way they want it to play out. And there's deeply ingrained, motivations for why they're doing what they're doing that like you can't undo. So you realize these characters are just helter skelter going to fly into the end scenario, and it's going to play out for them. And I won't do any spoilers, but the writers do a fantastic job at landing each of the ending storylines in ways that you don't expect, in ways that like I put down the book and I was like, fuck me, for just days after. Super, super good. It was also made into a film, but the film is terrible. So I would advise not watching the film.
That's why no one thought of it.
Yeah, it just tells you the story, gives you the ending, and there's no conflict, and there's no, they like to specifically take everything away from these zombies that made these zombies original to just make them basic, and then just tells you the ending. So it's like, well, you've just ruined a book for yourself, basically. So I'd advise everyone read that book. And as a writer, when I went back and looked at this and I found four corner conflicts, that was something I've always wanted to integrate into a story.
Yes.
But I've never found the right story to have characters divided across one point, four different characters. But it's something that's always made me try and raise the conflict within a story, so that if I don't have a full four corner thing, I'll at least put another character in who will add another perspective and give another point of conflict. If I'm writing something longer, that's a great way of keeping it super dynamic and keeping it moving the whole way through.
Would you say Four Corner Conflict, use your imagination a little bit here, is somewhat like the way authors use love triangles? Like conventional love relationship, simple, basic, but as soon as you add that third axis for things to swing around, there's complication and conflict, and you don't know what's the different people involved around the protagonist represent like kind of different values or different ideals of person.
Yeah, they're both zero-sum ideas. Like someone has to lose for another person or two other people to win. So it's similar in that way.
James, I was hoping to ask you some technical questions about this book. That sounds very good. So we have four. Do we have actually 4 point of view? Are they all first person or close third person?
Close third. Yeah.
And what I wanted to ask, and I'm really curious, is you say all 4 stories get resolved.
Yes.
Do some characters' arc or story ends in someone else's point of view then? Or do we have them one after the other? Because that would be tough, right?
I think all of them might end from their point of view, except I think one of them ends from a third point of view.
Because you see, that's my first issue.
It either ends from a third point of view or the closeness just moves out. I think the closest might move out because I think you might be in that character's point of view for their last chapter. I think it might just drift out a little bit towards the end.
In terms of point of view, because it sounds awesome, this book, but in terms of writing it technically, that sounds like the difficulty. Because what works in Game of Thrones, for example, in A Song of Ice and Fire, is that most of them are in different spaces. Like you have Jon, you have Daenerys, you have Tyrion. Most of them are in different spaces, so it makes sense for their stories to have different point of views. But when you have different point of views in the same existence, in the same room, in the same conflict, suddenly you got to decide, okay, who holds the mic in this moment? Who gets to narrate this ending? So basically, I would argue that someone has to take a back seat, and in this case, possibly 3 characters have to take a back seat if it's
Yeah, well, there's one, like the child is the main character, and the other characters I feel are opposites to one another, and then kind of one character which is like suppose the antagonist.
It sounds cool and incredibly difficult, and I admire the writer who pulled it off.
Yes,
it was written by one writer in particular, but I do think more than one writer worked on it.
Oh, okay.
So I had it here behind me. Something Carey, but I do think it was at least 2 writers that worked on it together because it's phenomenal. Like it's so good. I remember when I finished it, I was like, yeah, you would need multiple writers to work on it. And it came out like right at the height of the zombie craze, but it was a totally different type of zombie story that like did really interesting things with it.
That in itself sounds really interesting, the idea that it was written by multiple authors. I've been interested in that idea for so long. Do you know how they divided that or juggled that?
No idea, yeah.
Okay.
I don't know that maybe one person wrote it and then sent it to another who was editing and they made changes. I don't know what the situation was.
I'm making notes of things I want to look up after the episode as we go. Four Corner Conflict sounds actually really valuable to learn. I've never heard that concept, and now I really want to play with that. But also how the authors in this story divided that. I'd be fascinated to know that, because you're right, like you can just get more brain power on the project in theory, right?
Yeah, if you like both have, or if multiple writers have like a really clear vision on what the end product is, and you can all work together. Maybe one character takes one writer takes one character or something. I'm not sure, but yeah, because it's something that has to tie together so well because the characters are together and constantly in conflict. Yeah. So, yeah, I don't know.
A lot easier to pull off in television or movies, by the way, because you can have multiple characters on screen and no one feels like they're telling the story more than the other.
Yeah, amazing. I actually really want to check that out, and Four Corner Conflict sounds like a really valuable tool.
Incredibly valuable, even if you don't implement the full thing. I think, more conflict is always better in a story.
More conflict is always better. What does that say about us? Alex, What do you got for us?
So the one I'm going to talk about today is, it's especially in today's climate, it's not very popular as fiction. It's kind of an unpopular choice, but I think it is pretty foundational. So the one that I read years and years ago was Atlas Shrugged by Ayn Rand. And I want to talk about it not from an ideological perspective, because I think objectivism is pretty flawed. And if you've ever played BioShock, that's a pretty exaggerated example of why it's flawed. It's basically, the idea is basically just like, hey, one super powerful rich person should decide all the stuff for everyone else. Is basically the idea of a benign dictator. I am compressing that down a pretty significant degree, but it kind of does base on that. It's like, people should be allowed to use as much power as they're given. Essentially,
the strong will inherit the earth, and that's capitalism, baby.
Yeah, pretty much. So it's not as much like, because that's such a good idea, but what I want to talk about is the way that she does it, because I've never seen another book that has an idea so well. I'm trying to think of how to do it. Basically, using the vehicle of characters to pull for an idea so effectively. So the idea is that the characters in this book are all they're all pretty like cardboard. They're all pretty static. They don't have a lot to them. Basically, it's the idea of this woman who's she's essentially the protagonist. She inherits basically a train line, like a dicky little train line, from her brother, who owns the biggest sort of conglomerate of it. And she has to sort of build this train line and build it across the country to show that things are that it's basically possible. And all the while, sort of like the forces that be are doing all these backroom deals and things, trying to keep her down and all this stuff. And she meets up with all these different people, most men, who sort of help her in her quest to sort of like do this. And there's another guy called Hank Reardon who essentially makes this new metal that makes this train line possible. And it's kind of a rush against the clock to do things. But basically, despite the fact that all these characters are fairly wooden and hollow, it's almost presented as like a fable. It's like the idea of this story in service to an idea. Like the whole thing is in service to this idea of objectivism, which, as I've discussed, is not the greatest idea, but everything is kind of angled to do that. Like she's made these characters. I'm trying to think of the term. It's almost like a Brechtian play.
Yeah, it's a parable, right?
It's a
and
parable.
The whole thing is almost
That's
like
right.
a morality play trying to explain the philosophy.
Yeah. And there's these long stretches where the philosophy is quite literally like spelled out and stuff. And it's pretty engaging. Like as I keep saying, not like altogether the most accurate or something that we should base this civilization off, although we kind of have. But very, very, very compelling. Very compelling in a very interesting way to tell a story. And it's a long ass book too. It's like something like 1,000 pages. I've listened to it twice because there's something about the way this woman writes like these characters that, like, the way I'm describing it really sounds like a pretty terrible book, but it's not. It's
not
very, very engaging.
I'm all about this sort of thing.
It's like sci-fi novels are often they have their characters they have these big ideas at the expense of characters. And usually I don't like that at all. But this leans so hard into that concept that it's actually kind of brilliant.
Yeah.
And I don't really know how to describe it more than that.
Do you think the time of publication had something to do with that?
Yeah. There's definitely some ideas were more popular during that time, I think. But just the specific way that it kind of leans into this ideologueness without being it's preachy without being preachy, if you know what I mean. Like, it doesn't feel preachy as you're reading it. It feels very engaging and very well thought out. And I've just never seen another book that's been written in quite that same way. And I don't feel like I'm explaining it terribly well, but it had a big influence on me. Just that you could do that. You could just use a parable to tell a story, to explain an idea.
If it was just Ayn Rand talking at you for 300 pages about objectivism, it'd be, pretty dry, or a philosophy essay. And it could have been a philosophy essay. But she didn't write that. She wrote this pretty engaging
Tome.
character parable around which she wove her philosophy. Different elements of a philosophy are represented by different characters and stuff like that, right? So yeah, I totally get you. Like, she made it about as engaging as a philosophy essay can be in written form.
Yeah, what she said was that
100%.
like philosophy books often have a premise and then 3 or 4 characters sitting around discussing the
Yeah.
various philosophies on the
Like-
premise.
Like the
And all
Socratic
of the
dialogue, right?
characters are all of the
Yeah.
characters are somehow fully realized philosophers who know exactly how they think and exactly what their ethics are, and
Yeah.
they're sitting arguing for it. So she decided to do the opposite and just have each of the characters be an idea, and then each of them be completely unaware of their own idea and their own philosophy, and to actively just have each of these things play out, as in how would they play out if, you know, characters were like literally able to fully realize, because realistically we can't always fully engage in our own philosophies. There's various,
Because we don't have the means and things, but these characters
and
do.
various
So
relationships and emotional things going on. So she just removed all of that and was like, what happens if all of these philosophies were to play out, if philosophies were to embody people and play out across America, in the case of Atlas Shrugged, what would that look like? And because of that, it makes it is much more dynamic and very compelling, and it also poses the questions which she then later like answers through the telling of the story. And she does the same in The Fountainhead as well. If you've read that, it's kind of like the
preamble to it, for sure.
preamble to Atlas Shrugged. Yeah.
Also very engaging. Yes,
book. She really writes about she writes about men at work in a very, very engaging way.
She does.
Yeah, for
She
sure.
does.
She really does.
Yeah.
Not the band.
No. I suppose like it is kind of a philosophy of doing instead of a philosophy of thinking, and all the characters are massive doers. So that kind of embodies her philosophy as well, like bold, dynamic people striving toward the future, being billionaire capitalists. That's her philosophy, and that's the storyline. And yeah, you're right. I agree. Like, parts of it I found questionable personally. But
I find a lot of it questionable, but it's very compelling.
I found it very compelling as well. Yeah. I don't know if any of you guys have read Thus Spoke Zarathustra by Nietzsche.
I'm quite
a little bit,
Nietzsche. Quite familiar. One of my best friends was obsessed with that book.
Okay, similar kind of
in
thing.
a good way.
Yeah, because people are obsessed with Nietzsche aren't always. Same thing is like expounding on his philosophy through these different characters, and they represent different things about the world. And the main character Zarathustra is like this prophet of the new way. Like, we must discard all the old ways. We must be perfectly authentic to ourselves. Actually, it's not unlike Ayn Rand's philosophy in some ways.
Oh, I imagine she pulled pretty heavily from Nietzsche, frankly, like the Übermensch sort of.
Yeah.
You know.
Radical self-realization. Yeah, Alec, I think it's a good choice. I found it pretty mind-blowing as well. Yeah, it sort of shows what can be done with philosophy and fiction kind of crashing into each other.
Yeah.
All right. Can you guys guess what I've chosen? Can you guess?
Can we get a genre?
Historical fiction.
Oh, okay. It's Wolf Hall.
Oh, yeah.
It's Wolf Hall. Yeah, it's Wolf Hall. Look,
I almost no. Jokes aside, I almost picked it. I'm staring at it like, no, don't take Paddy's pick.
No, I'm a one-trick pony. Look, I've talked about this before, but only in little bits, and I want to talk a little more at length about why this is the best book ever written. When I say Wolf Hall, well, it is. I think it might be. When I say Wolf Hall, I mean the entire Wolf Hall trilogy. So Wolf Hall, Bring Up the Bodies, and The Mirror and the Light.
They're going to be spoilers for the later books.
I'm going to say
it's fiction. It's history. I mean,
I know it's history, but I don't. I'd still like to read the later books.
I don't think there will be spoilers. Actually, I'm going to try and make it spoiler free because everyone should read this if you haven't. And I want to preface by saying I actually read this in my early 20s, and I gave up after about 20 pages. It's something that demands your attention. I mean, Matan, you've read Wolf Hall as well, right?
Like
it's pretty dense.
Dense, yeah. But it's an acquired taste. But once you've acquired, boy,
yes,
yeah,
It is in every way Christmas cake. Very dense, but absolutely riven through with delicious currants, nuts. There's spices in there. You can't always tell exactly what the spice is, but by God, it makes it good. And once you get the taste, you'll never go back. I actually don't like Christmas cakes. This is a terrible metaphor. But the point is, it's
I was gonna
incredibly
say,
does?
I just imagine a Christmas cake with paprika, and I'm like, what the hell is going
Oh
on?
no.
This is how I imagine people enjoy Christmas cake. No, so it's historical fiction set in 1500s in Britain during the reign of Henry VIII. And what's fun is like the Henry VIII story is told so often, and we think we know who these characters are. We think we know who Henry VIII is. He's this capricious tyrant. We might think we know who Thomas Cromwell is, the main character of the story. He was Henry VIII's kind of right-hand man, skullcracker. He got things done in Protestant England, newly Protestant England. But she manages to take these characters like Henry VIII while not excusing them, because this ain't a spoiler, I don't think. He executes a bunch of his wives, make them as human and understandable as they can possibly be. Until there's points in the story where we like Henry. Even though we know he's going to execute any number of wives, won't say who, we end up liking him because she humanizes him so much. She almost paints him as this kind of like childish toddler who, when he's at his best, he's wonderful and he's magnanimous and he's interested in poetry and art and he can be very generous. But it's when he's stirred to the depths of depression and he's very depressive, it's when he's under incredible stress, stuff like that, he begins to lash out, take bad advice, because there's always advisors, and do some things that history is going to remember him terribly for. She doesn't excuse the guy, but he was actually maybe my favorite character of the novel. He's such a fascinating character portrait. He's not the main character, though. The whole thing is a character portrait of Thomas Cromwell, who... So what's interesting is most of the book is fairly close third. So third person, he did this, he did that. Close, so right over the shoulder. But she doesn't stick with close third. Like she when I read this, one of the things that blew my mind is there's so many things that we're told not to do and never to do. Like, don't change POV, right? If you're a third person book, stay in third person, first person, stay in first person. But of course, like one of the other rules of like writing is you can break the rules and sometimes you should. Her prose, I think, is so good that not only like can she, but she does it to really great effect. So sometimes when she wants us to really inhabit his mind, she'll just go first person. And suddenly wear the I think to myself, this, and this. But it doesn't feel jarring. It's so seamless that like you don't even notice. Yeah.
I've been reading 2 pages of what just happened?
Yeah, exactly. Sometimes she'll do fourth person. I've got an example here. So look, don't worry if what happens here doesn't make sense in context. Just like listen for the person. The commons sue for pardon, but will hand over the ringleaders. Captain Cobbler is stripped of his borrowed coat. But can we send Charles out to meet the next onslaught? Not unless we want trouble to break out again behind him. Can we send Charles out to meet the next onslaught? This isn't a character speaking, this is the narrator. But at that time, we're inhabiting England. Yep. We're inhabiting the court of England. We, at the moment, like she's inviting us to imagine that you are the court of Henry and England. Can we afford to do this as a nation? Absolutely beautiful. One more.
That's wild.
Thomas Boylan is with us. Earl of Wiltshire, Lord Privy Seal, etc., etc. Thomas Boylan is with us. We're just the people in the room at that point. It's so deft. And if I don't remember ever reading another author that does this. There probably have been, I'm just not remembering because it's not as good. But if you ever want to read an example of a book that does just incredibly, not only is the prose, I mean, it's my favorite prose of all. I love it. But it kind of stretches what can be done with conventions like that. I want to just give a quick example of second person as well. So the whole time, whenever she says you or he, she's talking about Cromwell. And she almost like trains you over the course of the book to know. If she says he, talking about Cromwell. She doesn't even see Cromwell, like he opens his eyes, you know it's him. Second person, It is a dark morning, and your eyes naturally turn towards Anne, but something shadowy is bobbing about on the fringes of the circle of light. It is dark morning, and your eyes naturally turn toward Anne. Like in that moment, like she makes us Cromwell just by doing that. And through doing that, she gives us so much sympathy for this character because there are times in the story where we are him, right? And when you are the character, it does something for your empathy and your understanding of why they do what they do. Matan, I can see you nodding along, and
It's just
I'm glad you
look,
agree.
that book, I think that, you know, they teach us the intentional fallacy. Like, we can't ever really know what someone meant. But when I think about Wolf Hall and about this author in particular, I just feel like it's one thing to master the language.
Yeah.
I feel like this author loves the English language. She didn't just master it. She loves the English language, and she wants to share what she believes can be done with it. And I think it's thin ice, because when you disregard conventions, sometimes it can be jarring. But
Yes.
Paddy said it perfectly. She trains you. She doesn't drop it on you from chapter one. She trains you that he is Cromwell. She starts slowly. By the third book, it almost feels like you're reading a different language, because by the third book, you've been trained to this kind of storytelling, and you feel like you're fluent in this kind of English.
Yeah.
And I think that it shouldn't be done lightly. I think that you really should master the language, and you should study the language if you want to embark on something like this. But there's so much that can be done with language beyond just thinking about plot and narrative and characters. English is incredibly deep. It's a language of 180,000 words, more or less. So much you can do with it, but it takes work, and it definitely feels like there's a lot of work behind this piece.
Yeah, well said. And I think reading Wolf Hall, the trilogy, takes work as well, but oh, it's so worth it. It's such a delicious Christmas cake. With I could go on at length, but I won't. But there is just one more thing that I suppose I was sort of always aware of this, but she does it so deftly that it really made me. How do I put this? It changed my view on how easily you can do something like this. So before reading the Wolf Hall trilogy, I'd be inclined to, if the characters, like, let's say they go somewhere in a car and they drive somewhere, I'd want to put in the details of them getting in the car and stuff like that. Even if you don't describe all the trip because it's boring, you give some details. There are times, though, where she just, like, cuts that entirely. So, brief quote, now at Austin Friars, we receive word from the king. Austin Friars' location, right? So before that line, we were at just another place in the book entirely, and just like, now at Austin Friars, we're served word from the king. She doesn't labor the transition at all because it's simply not interesting. She's just like, boom, now you're here and you're getting word from the king. And when I read stuff like this, because she does it all the time, I think, oh, you can do that? Like, you can get away with just saying, like, now you're here, don't worry about it. Just, we're here, we're going from this point. Which just allows her to focus on all the details that matter. Oh yeah, it was so good to, like, almost see, like, oh, she's giving me permission to use stuff like this in my writing. Like, seeing how a master does it. Yeah. Beautiful. Absolutely beautiful. So I believe some of you guys have some quotes from the works that you've chosen. Matan, you had one, I think, that you wanted to.
Yeah, I was actually hoping to just read the moment that Miss Lucy, the teacher, tells the reader basically what's up.
And
If
this
it's
is from
okay with
Dracula?
you. No, this is from Never Let Me Go.
Oh, sorry, yeah.
There's a Lucy in Dracula as well,
Yeah,
right?
okay.
I'm just gonna share my screen if that's okay. This is the moment from Never Let Me Go by Kasuo Ishagura. But Miss Lucy was now moving her gaze over the lot of us. I know you don't mean any harm, but there's just too much talk like this. She's, of course, referring to them talking about their future. I hear it all the time. It's been allowed to go on, and it's not right. I could see more drops coming off the gutter and landing on her shoulder, but she didn't seem to notice. If no one else will talk to you, she continued, then I will. The problem, as I see it, is that you've been told and not told. You've been told, but none of you really understand, and I dare say, Some people are quite happy to live it that way, but I am not. And if you're going to have decent lives, then you've got to know and know properly. None of you will go to America. None of you will be film stars. And none of you will be working in supermarkets, as I've heard some of you planning the other day. Your lives are set out for you. You'll become adults, and then, before you're old, before you're even middle-aged, you'll start to donate your vital organs. That's what each of you was created to do. You're not like the actors you watch on your videos. You're not even like me. You were brought into the world for a purpose, and your futures, all of them, have been decided. So you're not to talk that way anymore. You'll be leaving Halisham before long, and it's not so far off, the day you'll be preparing for your first donations. You need to remember that. And if you're to have decent lives, you have to know who you are and what lies ahead of you. Every one of you.
Oof. It hurts. And the teacher's not seen again after that, right? Like they don't teach the kids anymore.
They whisk her away. She kind of has
Yeah.
a mental breakdown.
Yeah.
She can't do this job.
Yeah.
Yeah.
My God, this is dark.
It comes completely unexpected. Like you think there's a secret, maybe, if you're paying attention, but you under no means did I imagine something wildly close to them
Yeah.
being clones for donations of vital organs.
I really want to ask you what happens in the end, but that's actually just too egregiously spoilery, so maybe I'll PM you
Yeah.
later.
I'd recommend reading it. There was also a film with Carey Mulligan, Andrew Garfield, and Keira Knightley.
Okay.
I can't remember if it was good or not.
It was not horrendous. It wasn't
It's not
horrendous.
Yeah.
I think if you're not a reader, which if you're not, probably not listening to this podcast, but
Probably not.
it's a good way to hear the story if you don't think you're gonna read the book.
Yeah, amazing. I want to read that so much.
Yeah.
James, I think you had a quote from your book you wanted to share as well.
I have a quote. It's a short one. Fear and hope exclude each other. They are twin emotions that cut the same channels through the spirit and leave the same grooves in the brain. That's from The Girl with the Gifts.
Yeah, no, that's beautiful.
That is beautiful.
I got one too, actually. This is from Atlas Shrugged. Do not let your fire go out. Spark by irreplaceable spark in the hopeless swamps of the not quite, the not yet, and the not at all. Do not let the hero in your soul perish in lonely frustration for the life you deserved and have never been able to reach. The world you desire can be won. It exists. It is real. It is possible. It's yours.
Holy shit! I'm gonna go work the field after this. I feel
Yeah.
really good. I'm gonna
Quite
start-
aspirational.
I'm gonna go build a railway. Yeah. Oh, she's like that. You definitely feel something. She stirs the
She's the
philosopher in you.
Elegant stirring for sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
You want to go work in a steel mill?
I want to own the steel mill.
Or start your own
I
field mill.
want
Yeah,
to get.
exactly.
I want
yeah.
a job that gives me blisters. After this.
Yeah. Thanks so much, guys. I really appreciate you sharing those works. And yeah, I think if there's one takeaway from today, I think it should be that really good books can have a really profound impact on the way we see the world, but also the way we write. One of the best ways to become a better writer and to really level up in our writing game is to read the greats. They're often great for a reason, and they'll have something that makes them exceptional that we can, if not steal, then use and adapt and riff on. Because yeah, these books are remarkable for a reason. There is a reason why they say that these are great works. Well, as ever, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. And if you enjoyed today, please consider giving us a rating and review. It really helps us out. And the New Mythic, our first anthology, has been made into a series of audiobooks. So if you're interested in hearing our writing done by some very, very talented professional actors, check out the New Mythic on ebook, paperback, or audiobook. And we are currently in the process of writing our second anthology. So stay tuned for more speculative fiction. Well, guys, this has been fantastic. Thank you very much for joining me. And listeners, join us next week for more tasty, tasty wisdom nuggets. Until then, this is Precipice Fiction. We'll see you next week. Bye-bye.
Bye.
That wasn't so bad.
Yeah, no, nice.
No, that's great. That's great. I enjoyed
I
that.
like that. I enjoyed that.
You're listening to Pros and Cons, the Precipice Fiction podcast.